day. For those who don't know me, I'm Ali Jacke. I'm the Director of Support for Learning at Uni SQ, and we're hosting SVA at present. I normally sit in the background of SVA, so you don't tend to see me that often. But until I can announce the news of our terrific new coordinator, which watch this space, that announcement will be coming very, very soon. I'm leaning in a little bit more today, and I'm welcoming you all here. Um, and I will say that every university and institution represented here today and in the network and any former members of the network will hear from us very soon to find out how your year is going. I know it's been very disrupted across the sector, and how you would like to work with SVA this year, how we can help, what your students are looking for, what you need as practitioners. You'll be hearing from us very soon. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter today. So, Ebe Ganon is a passionate advocate for inclusion and an award-winning changemaker and a regular speaker at events run by government, community, universities. And she is board chair of Children and Young People with Disability Australia and a research associate at UTAS. And last year, she completed her Masters of Disability and Inclusion at Deakin. So, the story behind today's presentation is that Ebe originally submitted this for our SVA symposium last year, but because the research was so interesting and it was such high quality work, we thought the findings were quite relevant to a number of institutions, and so we didn't want anyone to miss out. It's all also the reason that we have not locked this session down to just members because we want as many people to hear about this terrific research as possible and to be able to start those conversations or continue those conversations across the sector and across the country. So Ebe graciously agreed to present for us here today at our first practitioner network session for the year. So please join with me in welcoming Ebe today.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks everyone for being generous with your time today in joining this session. I'm dialing in from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country today, and I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional custodians of this land and also the lands from which you are all joining today. My research was conducted across borders, across a range of different Aboriginal lands, and I want to acknowledge the custodians of those lands as well. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you, which I'm hoping you have all received in advance. I am now kind of across a couple of screens, so if it looks like my eyes are darting around, it's because I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat and also keep an eye on my slides and moderately keep an eye on the time because I get incredibly time blind. In a moment, I'm going to ask a little bit about who you are and where you're dialing in from today, just so that I can tailor some of the insights that I give you today. I could monologue about this research for many, many, many hours, probably cumulatively days, and I want to make sure that what I present to you today is really useful to you. So in an effort to give this a little bit of structure, we love structure, I'm going to move through some introductions today. I'm going to tell you a bit about the rationale and the origin of my study and the research questions that I used, the method that I used, and I'll take you through the results and the discussion of findings. That's really the meaty part of what I want to share with you today, because that's really where all the lived experience insights come from. I will incentivize you to hopefully join me in doing some future research. And then we're going to move into a little bit of semi-structured discussion at the end. So I'm hoping to speak for about an hour, maybe a little bit more, so that then we can have some time at the end to maybe go out into smaller groups and discuss how you might be able to use some of these findings in your work. That is, of course, optional. Unstructured networking makes me break out in hives. So I completely understand if you don't want to stick around for that part. But I want to normalize using communication mechanisms that work best for you. So throughout the session today, please use the chat, use reactions. If you want to really briefly turn your microphone on, if verbal communication is more accessible to you, want to make sure that you have the opportunity to do that. I'm so happy to look at a budgie's butt, Bailey. So like if you want to show us the budgie butt, so I'm so open to that. And I'm sure everyone watching the recording is really confused right now because they probably can't see the chat. But at any rate, Um,
Thanks,
I'll,
Evie. She just flew away, but I'll try and get
oh,
her at some point so you can see her. She's cute.
please, always love to have animals. I'm sure that my cat, who's currently just sitting by my feet, will choose to make an appearance at some point. Many of you have met Mimi before, so hopefully you'll get to see her again today. Alrighty, so as Ali mentioned, my name's Ebe. I'm a former Deakin University postgraduate student. I'm a current research associate at the University of Tasmania. I also sit on the board of Children and Young People with Disability. I did my undergraduate studies at ANU, so you'll often see me kind of confusingly affiliated with like many different universities in visual and written ways. But basically, I'm addicted to the higher education sector. And in particular, I'm really passionate about the ways that students can participate in higher education leadership, and particularly in how students can lead the way that we offer student support and enable student success. It would really help me if you want to pop in the chat or really briefly turn your microphone on and shout into the void the kind of role that you hold, what brings you into this space. If you're a student, if you're a staff member, if you're staff, what kind of job you're doing. If you want to pop that in the chat or turn your mic on now, that will be really helpful for me to tailor some of the things that I tell you today. Can see people looking down towards keyboards, so I hope you're typing. Amazing. I, Kathy?
Um, I'm at Griffith. I'm actually the manager of the student disability and accessibility team, in other words, supporting our students at university, but also extremely keen to strengthen our student growth of students with disability. So I am working with that group and my partner thinks I'm in that. I don't know today. When you're working with that,
Awesome. Thank you, Kathy. And lots of contributions in the chat. We've got a little bit of a mix. Staff, students, advocates. Bailey, I relate, just kind of a little bit of everything and have been all of those things at some point in life, as lots of us who end up in these kinds of spaces are. So that's fantastic. Thank you. So I want to talk to you today about my research around student disability collectives. But before I do, I just want to take this opportunity to recognise that our community in the student disability collective space is hurting a little bit at the moment. We lost a really significant advocate in our space, Khan Tran, who was a fantastic, amazing advocate at University of Sydney, and who led the University of Sydney Disability Collective for a number of years. Khan was actually the instigator and the inspiration for why I ended up pursuing the research in this direction in the first place. Khan was one of the first people who ever invited me to speak at an interstate event about the Disability Royal Commission at the time. But when I was speaking at that event, I was thinking about what vibrant and important spaces student disability collectives are and continue to be. And when I then came around to doing my master's research, that thought kind of boomeranged back to me, which is how I ended up along this line of research today. I can see some tributes in the chat as well to Khan. So I just wanted to acknowledge that today. We're perhaps not feeling as vibrant as we would usually be because of this, but I know that this is research that Khan was really supportive of, and they really assisted with some of my recruitment as well. So just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware and can celebrate Khan's really important work through their career. And it is a really huge and sad loss for us in the community. So student disability collectives, as I've alluded to, are spaces where students come together on university campuses to engage in advocacy, to provide peer support to each other, and to offer services that perhaps have not been offered by universities themselves. Collectives fill a lot of gaps, and they've really emerged from understandings of students about what other students need. Disability collectives aren't the only kinds of collectives that exist. You might be aware of women's collectives or queer collectives or First Nations collectives on your campuses. As I'll go on to sort of show you throughout my research, about half of Australian universities have student disability collectives. The other half are a combination of they have had a collective in the past, but it's potentially inactive, or I haven't been able to find any kind of indication that those universities have ever had this sort of student collectivism on campus before. But from my lived experience in my undergraduate degree, I understood that student disability collectives are really important spaces for students to come together, and they provide services and advocacy that, for a range of different reasons, universities can't or choose not to provide. On this slide, I have a range of different disability collective logos, as well as a few pictures of the kind of activities that these collectives can engage in. One of my favourites that I came across, it's not something I was able to attend, but last year the Deakin Disability and Neurodivergency Association ran a special interest in hyperfixation PowerPoint night, which just like, how good, a whole bunch of, a high density of neurodivergent students and disabled students coming together to just monologue about the things they are most passionate about in life. What an incredible space to create. Disability collectives also usually have really strong presences at orientation week, market days, those kinds of events. It's how they reach out to students and do a lot of recruitment. And they run lots of social events as well to offer kind of autonomous peer spaces. When I say autonomous throughout the presentation today, I mean spaces that are specifically built for disabled students at the exclusion of non-disabled students and staff. So they are specifically spaces for solidarity to be able to share in a safe environment the experiences that disabled students have. So reflecting on my own experience of how significant these spaces are, and also my experience in talking about how collectives can help lead the change towards more inclusive higher education environments, I was really shocked to find that there is literally no peer-reviewed research out in the world that focuses on what disability collectives do, who they are, how many there are, and all those kinds of things. This is a really crude example of a literature search. This is not the limitation of the literature search I did, by the way. There was a lot more literature searching that went on, but this is a representation of what happened when I input any kind of keywords that would help me find out about Australian student disability collectives in universities. So as a result of that, I developed up my research questions. I'm a human rights nerd, and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability is one of my special interests. So I wanted to overlay a human rights lens into the research that I did. So the first thing that I needed to do was ask, what is the prevalence, nature, and function of SDCs in Australian universities? And that was really because there was no quantitative understanding of what really is the prevalence of these groups. Where are they? How are they sort of emerging from different university cultures? The second one, and this was the really meaty one in terms of my data collection, was how do SDCs shape the experiences of students with disability? And that's really the qualitative piece in terms of what do collectives do to the experiences of students who engage with them, and what can we learn from that? And then my third research question, which I won't touch in too much detail on today, but if you want to nerd out on the CRPD with me at some other point, then please reach out, is what role, if any, could collectives play in the realisation of Article 24 in Australian universities? And Article 24 is about inclusive education. As a brief aside on that, universities tend to sort of get a bit let off in terms of Article 24 implementation. When we talk about Article 24 in human rights spaces, everyone's usually very interested in early childhood settings, primary schools, sometimes high schools, but generally when we get to discussions around tertiary education, that rights discourse sort of starts to drop off. I'm going to the Conference of State Parties for the UNCRPD later this year in New York, which is very exciting. And this is hopefully something I'm really hoping to kind of bring to the fore a little bit. At any rate, research questions, those happened. I developed those. In looking at how to address those research questions, I know not everyone is super interested in the background of all the research, so I won't spend too much on this, but I used mostly qualitative design, though arguably mixed methods, to understand both the prevalence and experiences that sit around collectives. Lack of existing research meant that I needed to approach things in a bit more of an exploratory way. I would have loved to have been able to go more deeply into all of the kind of initial indications that I got in my findings, but due to the just total vacuum of information, I have really spent a lot of time kind of establishing the basics. And any students in the room, a lot of what I'm going to talk about, particularly in my quantitative findings, is really, really obvious to us, but has never ever been recorded in peer-reviewed research. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. I did semi-structured interviews with 6 students. I conducted those and did the analysis, which was then cross-verified by my supervisor. We used reflexive thematic analysis, and that allowed really the findings to lead the sort of points of discussion that we ended up with. I didn't want to start with any assumptions about what I would find. And then, of course, I did a bit of supplementary desktop research to do a little bit more of that quantitative piece. So this fun thing, which is results. So when I did this, the quantitative desktop research, which was sort of towards the beginning to middle of last year, so there may have been a little bit of shift in this since then, but I found that 20 out of 42 Australian universities have a collective that I could verify was student-led and was currently active. Plus another 5 universities where I could see evidence that a collective had at some point existed, but the Facebook page was inactive. There wasn't a web page where I could verify it was still existing. So for the purposes of this research, I have assumed that those still operate to kind of be more generous as to the kind of existence of these collectives. The skeptic in me says that I probably shouldn't be nice to universities, but I have been. So there you go. Through that desktop research, I found that most disability collectives have common activities, approaches to governance and structures of membership. So most disability collectives, they have a relatively free-flowing approach to membership. There's not a membership list and a distribution that is fixed and super official. The way that I spoke to most participants and what I could see online, their membership is kind of constituted of people who engage with their work online, people who are members of their online communities on social media, people who attend their events, and people who participate in their advocacy, as well as people who approach those collectives for support and assistance, particularly around self-advocacy to the university to assist in realising their rights. Some interesting findings that I've gleaned from doing this work is, and I've since gone back and done a little bit more rigorous statistical analysis to work out like which of these things are statistically significant. But the most telling feature of a university that will tell you if they are likely to have a disability collective is the governance format of their overall student association and kind of main student voice mechanism. So universities that have an independently run student association, and by that I mean generally an association or a guild or a council or a union that has its own constitution that is led by students and to which I guess the university administration doesn't have influence in how that's run. It doesn't make budgetary decisions. It doesn't make governance decisions. Those universities are way more likely to have a collective. My research showed that 96% of universities that have that independently run student association format have a disability collective. Universities that have that university administrated student representative mechanism, so maybe there's a council that sits under your DVCA, maybe there's a kind of representative body that students can nominate to, and then staff look through the EOIs and they pick the students. Those sorts of formats are far less likely to demonstrate this kind of collectivism, which I think is really interesting. My hypothesis was that Group of 8 universities with that kind of very long traditional history of kind of student activism and advocacy would be more likely to have an SDC. That came out a little bit in the numbers. The statistical significance wasn't super high, so I'm not emphasising that as much as the kind of student association governance format. But interesting, the regional universities network affiliated universities were vastly the least likely to have student collectives. And that kind of gels with our understanding about how student engagement can work at some of those regional and remote universities. And I'm sure we all have lots of stories about students who are enrolled in those rural and regional universities are sometimes more likely to have a whole range of other competing responsibilities, working responsibilities, that mean that engaging in this kind of student collectivism might not be accessible to them. And that's something that we should keep in mind, because as I'll go on to show you, engaging in this collectivism is extremely significant and beneficial to students' experiences. And we really want to make sure that that's available and accessible to everybody. So that's something that I'm going to kind of turn back to you at the end of the session to think about how we might be able to do that. Kate, have you got a question at this point?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Was it I may have missed you saying this. Was it only looking for disability collective, like that terminology, or were you looking, for something?
Yeah. So in my search, I looked at everything from disability network, club, accessibility association. The easiest way to find them is to look at if there's a disability representative at a university, and therefore like if they've got a little club or a network or a collective attached to them. But I used a whole range of synonyms after doing a kind of pilot search to sort of work out what kind of terminology people were using. But the most commonly used one is collective, which is why I've applied that as the sort of general term in the research. But I spent more time than I'd like to admit Googling around the depths of the internet, looking around student association constitutions to see if there was any reference to, groups like this, scrolling through endless Facebook pages that are affiliated to a university and the concept of disability to kind of find evidence of this. So that sort of kind of close to 50% rate was what I hit on after looking at a range of different synonyms, respecting that, collective is not always the most common one used depending on the culture of the university. Something that I want to look a little bit more closely at is that second point in the fifth box, which is communities with a stronger culture of independent student advocacy, unionism, or critical consciousness oriented towards activism and advocacy. So I have some sense that universities that do possess that culture seem to have collectives, not just disability collectives, but collectives in general emerging more often. I haven't been able to prove that statistically through what I collected, but I think that if we looked across a range of different types of collectives and did a much bigger kind of mapping exercise there, I have a strong sense, based on what students told me, that this is kind of what we'd see. And so that's kind of an invitation to those of us working in the student voice space to think about what we can do to hand the baton over to students, rather than relying on staff-led approaches or staff-student partnership approaches as a default, which I appreciate is kind of uncomfortable for those of us who are employed as people who do staff-student partnerships, and our job is to, amplify student voice. We don't necessarily want to write ourselves out of jobs. So I understand that's a kind of challenging thing to think about in this space. But the most important and most interesting part of the findings of my research are really these qualitative findings. So from my interviews with 6 students, they were students from universities across 4 different states. They were students who were at varying different stages of study, an even mix of postgraduate and undergraduate students. I didn't speak to any first-year students. I didn't even have any first-year students indicate interest in participating in the study, which is pretty interesting, and we'll talk about that later when I get to the limitations. They had a mix of different impairment and disability experiences, to use the language that the students themselves use. I spoke to students who experience chronic illness. I spoke to students who are neurodivergent. I spoke to a deaf student. So I had a really good kind of mix of different experiences and different motivations for wanting to engage with a disability community. So from those interviews, I transcribed them. I used Zoom to help me do that. But as we all know, some of those transcription tools are not terribly accurate. And I really like to make sure that the exact structure of the sentences that people are using is reflected in the data that we analyse, because I think particularly in the disability community, we have really interesting nuances in the way that we communicate, and I think that's really important to preserve. That said, like as an autistic person with auditory processing differences, transcribing and like doing that kind of stuff was just like didn't love it. I reflected on it later, and it was potentially something I could have asked for as a reasonable adjustment to my study to get funded for that to be done by someone who's paid. I didn't really know that at the time. And like, you do your first thesis once. You do your first thesis first, and you don't always know what you can ask for. And as I've been talking about my research, I've been kind of asked questions about my experience doing the research as a disabled and neurodivergent student as well. And so I've kind of been trying to kind of wear a bunch of different hats in the way that I'm talking about it, because I think people have found it interesting and useful. But at any rate, I used reflexive thematic analysis to code my data, which resulted in 3 different domains of themes, which each had a number of kind of sub-themes under them. So my first domain of themes that emerged from the interview data tells us about the shared values and attributes of the students who engage with student disability collectives. So this finding is really about who are these members of student disability collectives, what are their values, what kind of skills and traits do they have, and I guess like how do they relate to other students, and how do they relate on their campuses. So I found that collective leaders and members are firstly from diverse study backgrounds. So they're not all coming from international relations, politics and law. They're coming from medicine, they're coming from business, they're coming from sciences, they are also coming from law, but perhaps a little bit more diverse than you might first think. And when you think about the kinds of advocates that you relate to and that you connect with on a regular basis in your work. They're highly engaged and widely connected. So all of my participants reflected on a range of different roles that they hold, potentially in addition to their membership of a collective. 5 out of the 6 participants that I spoke to were at some point, past, present, a leader of their collective, which is another interesting limitation that I'll talk to later. And they know people. They talk about being the person that other students come to get referrals to go to somebody, or they're the person who knows about this thing, and they get invited to these meetings. That attribute in particular is interesting. For some students, that seemed to be a characteristic they've always had in life. But for other students, it seems like something that their capacity was built in a way through their engagement with the collective, such that they became that person over time. I know my own lived experience. My comment about networking and hives, and also connecting with people that I don't know and I've never met before, had sometimes been a barrier. I was lucky to live on campus in my first couple of years at university, which made a huge difference to kind of being situated within a pre-existing community. If I hadn't have had that, I'm not really sure how I would have moved through my undergraduate degree, and it might have been pretty lonely. And that kind of resonates with some of the comments from my participants as well. These participants are justice oriented and critically conscious. They're so aware of power dynamics. They're so aware of discrimination and marginalization around them. They are driven to make things better for not necessarily themselves, but lots of kind of verbal constructions around making things better for the people who come after them, or for those who don't have the capacity or it's not accessible to them to speak up for themselves. They're passionate and they're driven, and that's really linked in with the 5th one, which is they're angry, tired, and frustrated. And shortly, I'm going to show you some examples of that coming through in the raw data. But these are students who are so tired of seeing discrimination and ableism at their universities. And despite limitations that may result from their personal experience of impairment or disability, particularly students who experience chronic pain and chronic fatigue, they will not give up. They will not give up on advocating for others. They will not give up on a point. They will continue to push and continue to find ways to fix the system, potentially at the detriment of their own well-being. and I have some commentary around that a bit later on. But the passion and resilience, and we can problematize the word resilience in a lot of different ways, but in the very sort of traditional sense, they bounce back constantly and will keep working. So here are some kind of quotes from this domain. I'll read them out. Feel free to look away from the screen while I read them out. I just know that some people prefer to have it verbal, but then other people don't like to then see the same words written down while I'm saying them. So I'm trying to kind of balance a few different access needs here. So the first one, I couldn't get over these conversations, and it's all the same issues across all the universities. And I'm like, how is, like, we're all fighting about the same thing. This participant here is talking about connecting with other disabled leaders across different universities and talking about the fact that different universities have the same challenges reflected, and that when they come together as student leaders, they can create these economies of scale and advocate more efficiently. You'll notice throughout the quotes, by the way, that I've taken the university names out and I've just made sure to kind of indicate the state. My goal here is not to call out individual universities in the way that they're working, but I think it's also important to kind of maintain the authenticity of the way that students were describing their experiences. So Queensland University for culture is problematic because it's often silent. Lips are sealed. Nothing to see here. No public opposition or advocating for disability access. Participant 4 here is describing their experience at Queensland University for where they feel like disabled students and staff have been silenced, and where they feel like other interest groups are being prioritised over the disability community. The final one, I would never have really continued much with my personal advocacy because I don't see the worth in me just complaining and hurting myself and getting up all the time. But for someone else, I will do it every single day. Every single day, I will stand up for them. And that kind of shows you the commitment that some of these students have to their communities, potentially at their own detriment, which is challenging. It's an emotional burden to hear about this a lot. People send me some of the emails and stuff that their supervisors have sent them, and it's horrible. It's just hard. This was a postgraduate participant who was talking about their role as a collective leader and some of the things and the vicarious trauma they experience as a result of doing that job, but they are deeply committed to supporting their community. If I wasn't so dead set on dealing with these issues because I had to jump over like 4 or 5 people's heads at some point, I just don't see that the university at the beginning actually getting to the stage where it's at. This is a participant who has identified that if they didn't, or their collective didn't do this work, then no one else was going to. No one else was coming to save them. So they needed to do this advocacy for themselves. My second domain of findings was the shared experiences of students who engage with student disability collectives. The first sub-theme there was straight up ableist, a backdrop of challenging experiences of students of university structures, systems, and cultures. So across all 6 participants, all of them described these ableist and challenging and discriminatory features of their university experience that were going on before, during, and after their engagement with the disability collective. The second one is I am disabled, developing and understanding identity, disclosure, and intersectionality. So all participants engaged with this idea that through engaging with their collective, they had this very transformative journey towards understanding their disabled identity better, or alternatively, understanding the perspectives of people who had a different lived experience to them. There was an interesting kind of like divide there in the participant cohorts. For the participants who were perhaps late diagnosed neurodivergent students or developed chronic illness later on in life, the collectives was really formative in them understanding what disability meant to them, and helping them to shape how they describe their disability. For those who had experienced disability from birth, and who had already connected in some way with a disability community, my deaf participant was a really good example with this. They were someone who had been closely engaged with the deaf community for a long time, and had really had a sense of their disabled identity and the political nature of that identity for a long time. Their experience was more understanding the diversity of different disability experiences, and how people with different experiences to them have a different way of relating to that concept. There's also such rich data about the intersection of gender and sexuality, and a whole range of other things, calm and CALD experiences as well with disability. Let's have another chat about that, because that's a whole nother 90-minute presentation, and like so much of this data is so rich to the point of being overwhelming. But at any rate, the third theme here was more than just one person, participants searching for and finding community, peer support and solidarity. I'll show you some quotes about this. They say it way better than I can. And finally, there's just so many diverse colours, building transformative knowledge, skills, and understanding of diverse perspectives. So that's all the way from understanding the different perspectives on disability, all the way to the practical considerations of participants learning how to analyse policy, learning how to run an event, learning how to mobilise a community of people, learning how to run a Facebook page and do digital communications. All of these incredibly useful practical skills that students didn't and wouldn't have learned in the classroom, but have learned in these self-created environments, necessitated by the demands of their membership. If your membership says, we want this, if your membership says we want a disability space on our community, well, you're going to have to go and work out how to advocate to get one. And then when you do, you're going to have to work out where the couches should go. And you're going to work out how to get signage on your university. And there's such great examples of just the capacity of students being built through these activities. Now, there are so many quotes in this slide deck, so I'm going to selectively read some of these out, and you have a copy of this that you can go back through and read in more detail. I also have a much longer list of quotes if you're like super interested in exactly what students had to say. So please shoot me an email, which I'll give you at the end of the session. I'm very happy to share that as well. So this is speaking, these quotes are mostly speaking to, I guess, the experiences of ableism that students have had. A medicine student said, and then when I had my first conversation with the disability support team, I told them what my disability was, and they're like, oh, are you sure medicine is the right degree for you? One of so many examples of pretty much the exact same narrative again and again that students tell me. Participant 3 said, people come up to the collective at market day, is the context of this quote, and say it's just that they either feel lonely in their experience with university if they've been around for a while, or they're so happy to see that other people exist that might understand them. So this is, people who have perhaps never had an opportunity to connect, they see this collective, and that even just the visibility of that collective, helps them in their journey. Some of these are talking about the kind of skills that students have developed. The first quote on this page, I think, is the most interesting for this particular group of people. Participant 5 said, but in terms of how much more students are able to engage and create community and feel a part of something, I feel as if that is a resource that no area of the university can ever create. One thing that is said around my university in particular a lot, the events where it's co-organised by a student typically perform better than if just a staff member's doing it. They can't work out why. And I just think that's so telling that students are able to identify that, like, when staff organise events by themselves that aren't informed by student perspectives, it's cringe. Like, students understand when it's cringe. The cat's here, by the way. And they know that when there are events, oh God, now the cat's closing my slides. That's super unhelpful. Thanks, Mimi. She's a disabled ally, by the way, but sometimes likes to sabotage my work. Whereas when things are organised by students as well, and when students are speaking the same language as other students, and particularly when student subgroups, like disabled students, are speaking the same language as other student subgroups, it resonates. The third domain is about the participant views on the relationship between disability collectives and broader university goals of inclusion. So this was not an intended aspect of my research at all. But because of the aforementioned critical consciousness and like justice orientation of these students, all of them had a huge amount to say about what universities should be doing, what the problems are with what universities are currently doing, and also the significance of what they are doing in their collectives to the broader goals of universities in terms of student equity. So the first subgroup on that one was participants identifying that disability is a very different kind of equity group, balancing disability inclusion with other inclusion efforts. And this was really about students comparing the way that students with disability are managed and treated, and the way that disability as a topic is approached at their university compared to other cohorts like First Nations students and staff, as well as LGBTQIA+ students and staff, and also the way that gender equity is kind of managed in universities. I'll show you a few quotes about that. Really significantly, participants commented on the way that their collective changed the trajectory of the rest of their life. It was formative or central to their university experience. Most participants, 5 out of the 6, made some comment to the effect of, I wouldn't have finished my degree if it wasn't for my collective. They talked about how lonely it was before their collective, and many of them spoke about how their primary networks, their primary support system, even for those who had left the collective since, remains very core and central to their overall support networks in their life. Most of them were unable to describe what their university experience would have looked like if the collective had not been there. One participant, for them, this was slightly less significant. That participant was a little bit older, was a recent graduate, and had done postgraduate studies. However, they did still note the degree to which their collective involvement enhanced their experience in a way that was very meaningful. But the rest of them described, with some synonyms, that their collective was central and completely formative to their experience. And finally, we need the importance of the existence of collectives. So students making kind of meta commentary about how universities should be supporting collectives to thrive, and the importance of every single university having one for the sake of the disabled students on campus. Just at that point, bit of a tangent, but I did some analysis about the tendency for universities with higher and lower proportions of students with disability on campus to have or not have disability collectives. There was nothing statistically significant about the percentage of students with disability on campus and the likelihood of a university having one. That said, there's a lot of issues with, as we all know, the data collection around students with disability on campus. We also can hypothesize about the fact that universities that have lower declared numbers and also don't have collectives on their campus may not have a culture of safe disclosure, thus meaning there is no collective and disclosures are low. We can also say that, potentially universities that have higher numbers and have, or higher proportions, I did proportion, not number, just to account for the differences in sizes of university, which was also not significant, by the way. We can say that universities that have those higher numbers and do have those collectives, whether or not those are related, I'd love to kind of look into that to see if collectives could be a tool for ameliorating some of our issues with like disability data collection. So anyway, happy to have a data tangent with you guys offline, but at any rate, some of the final quotes here. Participant 1 said, I think if most universities can have a chess society and a Harry Potter club and a business society and whatever random niche groups, the bare minimum that we could do is have a disability society or collective, because we know that statistically 20% of people in Australia suffer with some sort of disability, health condition, etc. Participant 6 said, we collectives are essential. I think university, I think, is when people start kind of considering these other identities. And I think disability is becoming recognised as one, and we need to be there to support students in that. That reflects a broader narrative as well of university being, as we all know in this space, a very transformative time in a student's life, regardless of the identities and the experiences that they have, of kind of coming into their own and developing a self-conceptualization of how they describe themselves, who they are, and the development of a disabled identity for students with disability is a huge, huge part of that. And for the students who don't have access to these spaces, I really wonder how they go through that in a way that is rights-based and that is neuroaffirming and in a way that is strengths-based and in a way that celebrates disability pride. I don't know for universities who don't have these spaces how students engage with those ideas and concepts. And again, an opportunity for more research is like, what implication does that have on the broader well-being of students? So another theme throughout this research is just a lot of questions about, you know, the absence of student collectivism and the impacts that that has on universities' broader goals around student well-being. What are we doing that's countering our objectives in the mental health and wellbeing space by either suppressing in some cases or simply not encouraging the development of these spaces? Participant 2 said, you know, we've got the Indigenous pathway in medicine, for example, to try and make sure that we have enough Indigenous doctors for, you know, Indigenous people in society so that we're actually getting, you know, firsthand experience on those issues. I think that's really important. Should we have something like that for disability? Participant 4 said, the LGBTQIA plus community is getting all of that support. Great. My university is kowtowing, listening to everything they got to say, changing everything. And the students in Brisbane are receiving, like, LGBTQIA plus students and Indigenous students are getting great support, which is great. But you know what? Students with disability are not getting the support we need. We're at the bottom of the ladder. So this student has engaged in study at 4 different universities in Queensland. They have a really broad understanding of the different ways that different universities are engaging in this space. They're talking specifically about one university here, but you know, they're reflecting on the fact that disability seems to be the poor cousin, the bottom rung of the ladder. So that's very interesting and telling. This quote at the top here is talking about that transformative period of time. It's such a time of change and growth for us when we're in university. I feel like these are our formative years of discovering who we are as adults. And I think it's an important stepping stone to create sort of advocates of the future and to have a group where, you know, you can just chat to other disabled people. Participant 5 said, the skills that I learned in that collective were one of the turning points in my life. I don't think I ever even self-advocated before that because I just kind of gave in to whatever issues I had. Like, I knew for some people who were coming into the collective, they'd been advocating on all sorts of different levels in terms of national as well, state, all that sort of stuff. And that was something that really opened up to my eyes and allowed me to look beyond just myself and the university area. And that's a Participant 5's transcript just like took me so long to go through because they had so many poignant and really like incisive insights like that. And they had this really transformative journey from someone who just never engaged in advocacy, didn't speak up, didn't have the skills to do it, to someone who continues to advocate at very high levels to this day, which is really fantastic and exciting. Oh God, what am I doing here? I'm losing the way. There's lots of other quotes here. Please go back and have a read through them because they're really telling. I'm just trying to give you a really broad overview there. And these quotes describe so much better than my rambling prose the significance of this experience to students. So I really encourage you to look at that and If you need to use this data in some way in the future, I'm open to discussing how we might use this research to support maybe future business cases. I should have some articles coming out in the next couple of months that you can also reference, which would be very exciting. Anyway, findings, significance. Collectives were never recorded by scholarly research before. This is really foundational for us to be able to actually do this research in the future. The most frustrating part of my thesis was, oh my goodness, I'm spending so much time writing stuff that is so obvious to me and I'm bored and I don't want to do that, but I have to because no one else has. And because of the way academia works, I need to establish that in a way that's evidence-based, in a way that academia will understand. And that's deeply frustrating. And those who engage in student voice research, particularly in this very student-led way, might resonate with that general sense of frustration. But I've had a journal paper accepted that will be coming out hopefully in April or May that at least does the definitional work, it does the quantitative work, and it provides us with a foundation of some of that statistical analysis that says, this is significant in the emergence of collectives, this isn't, and here are some questions for how we might do future research. There's another paper that is requiring a lot more work going on the next couple of months that publishes the qualitative findings, insights of students. I just have so much data and I'm overwhelmed about how to present it to be super transparent. But I'm really hoping to get that out because I think that it's really useful evidence for future kind of business cases around supporting student collectivism. Secondly, it improves our understanding of those conditions which foster that vibrant student collectivism. I've told you about some of those kind of initial indications about things that are and aren't significant, in particular, the kind of student voice and student representative mechanism that is present at your university. If you are still running with a staff-led and staff administrative, staff have the final say model of student voice, you're missing out. Sorry. And I'm not going to call out any individual universities here. You know who you are. And I'm not saying that that is 100% within your control. But if you can become a champion for student-led initiatives that are 100% authentically student-led at your institution, then you will be shifting the dial towards something that is going to be vastly more valuable to your student body than the ability to have the privilege to submit an EOI, to be on a representative group that is actually just administrated by the university, that is not binding in terms of any kind of decision making. And ultimately, is it something they can put on their resume? Sure, that's nice. But is it something that's going to change in a formative way their life experience on campus and those of the students around them? I'm going to say probably not. It's not very scholarly of me to say, but it is grounded in my lived experience. And in this space, I'm fairly willing to weight those evenly. Finally, we also have an understanding of the values, the skills, and the attributes that are fostered by disability collectives and also that they imbue on students who engage with them, which is really meaningful. We spend a whole lot of money in universities on dinky little programs that aim to teach students how to do this or motivate students to do that. And that's nice. And I'm sure that that has an impact on some students. And I'm sure that there are some universities who are doing great evaluation on that. And that's awesome. Keep doing that work. It's really important and it matters. But also, there are a lot of initiatives that we don't evaluate, a lot of initiatives that are busy work, and a lot of initiatives that aren't cutting through in the same way as these student disability collectives are. So have a think about that. Particularly in the context of student voice, there are a lot of lessons in this research for student support, particularly for how to support critically conscious student leaders. One finding I haven't touched on in such a detailed way in my discussion so far is well, I have spoken about this part, which is the nature of student leaders in particular to work at the detriment to their own mental health, but also their mental health and self-esteem being bound up in the success of their advocacy work. So it's both a really challenging and high demand pursuit to be engaging in this advocacy, but they love it. And it's really important for the way that they understand who themselves and their identity. And so when those students approach student support services and they go, I'm really overwhelmed and I need help I need mental health support, and I also need you to help me navigate my studies because I need extensions. I don't know how to do it. Please help me. What's really unhelpful is when student support staff go back and say, oh, well, you might be doing too much. Have you thought about doing less? Have you thought about stepping back from your student engagements, your student advocacy, your volunteering? And that's really harmful and unhelpful for those students because they gain so much self-worth from doing that work. And actually, what student support staff need to be thinking about is the two sides of that coin, and what suggesting that those activities are not valuable is actually doing to that student. Again, all of those things we always talk about in this space, bringing student leaders to the fore, deferring to student-led initiatives. You've got some nice budget, maybe kick it towards the collective because they will do a lot of work with that, and learning from student-led offerings and demand. One particularly interesting example of that was there was a student who was at a Victorian university, and they were talking about their time as leader of their disability collective, where they used and pulled together all of the different kind of adjustments that students with disability had been offered throughout the course of their study. Because as I kind of indicated a bit earlier, when you don't know what you can ask for, you don't know what you can ask for. And that's a really difficult process. And if you're working with an accessibility staff member who doesn't understand your lived experience or hasn't worked with a student in your area before, like any postgraduate students listening to this will be like, ugh, me, doing research and going to the accessibility service and asking them like, hey, what can you do? They're like, oh, that's such a great question. We only know how to like support students with coursework. But understanding that this collective was pulling together all of this information, all of this data, and they produced this incredible resource on like grouped different ideas around adjustments you can ask for, when they might be useful, how to ask for them, different modifications. And the university censored that. They didn't want it distributed because they were worried that students would come and ask for things. They were worried that students might know what would help them and that they might ask for those things, and that it would become a shopping list of adjustments. And that just like, I used to work on the flip side, I used to work in a student experience division at a university as a professional staff member. And so I've seen the conversations that have on the back end, which, you know, understandably there's anxiety around fairness and making sure that students have adjustments that are reasonable, both for the student and for the university. And that perhaps there's another webinar happening simultaneously to this about disability justice, run by ADSET, fabulous scholar who has just come from, Emily Gaspar, who's just come from the States, talking about the experience of, sorry, this is a tangent, disability practitioners who have lived experience of disability, who put a lot more weight into the lived experience of the student as knowledge that can help that student know what they need. On the flip side of that, you have some practitioners in the space who don't appreciate the lived experience perspective and don't want to give the students priorities for what they think they need to be supported with the same kind of weight as like an OT report, or like, you know, the research that they've read or the experience that they have. So instead, disability collectives have like popped up to fill that gap and popped up to provide students with what they need to do their advocacy. That's just one example of where they pop up to fill gaps. Same as, you know, when they create guerrilla disability spaces, where the university has decided that they don't want to create an autonomous space for disabled students to decompress and come together. So they created their own. We can learn a lot from the sorts of things that these collectives do as a response to a lack of provision from the university. But the most important insight, learning from collective community building, self-determination and accessibility, autonomy and authenticity are key. Disability supports that are led by students with disability are the most effective disability supports as told by students with disability. And the authenticity, that can be relationships between staff and students. It can be the sorts of information that is shared with students. And it can be the kind of services that are provided. Authenticity is key, and students can sense that when things are authentic and when they aren't. Thinking back to that example of events that are organised just by staff and events that are organised either in partnership or just by students. Limitations of my research, there's so many of them, and I want to talk about them because I hope that in future those who are listening and who are here today can help like fix some of those limitations and can help do research that can fill in some of those gaps. Reliability of the publicly available and current information online relating to these collectives. Crikey, every university has a different website structure. Every student association has a different way of laying out their stuff. Document like version control, holy gee, there are like, you know, links on university websites that are like, look at our 2020 to 25 disability inclusion plan. And then it's like a disability inclusion plan from like 2008. Like, what are we doing? Can we please fix this? Also, student disability collectives, if you're listening, it'd be really great if you all just had a page on a publicly available website that said that you exist. I promise that that will help you with your recruitment and helping students know that you exist. It also helps people like me who are, you know, I don't use Facebook anymore. I've gotten rid of most of my social media. So here I am digging through these social media sites, trying to find evidence of these things existing. I'm sure I'm not the only young person in the world who has gotten rid of a lot of these social media accounts. And if you don't have those, really hard to find the existence of these spaces, and therefore you're becoming exclusive. So let's be open and accessible and publicly available for students to join. There was a definitive leader bias in my sample. 5 out of the 6 students I spoke to were at some point leaders in their collective. I think like most of us who work in the sort of like management space in university would be aware of the research that tells us that leaders of teams are more likely to say that those teams are inclusive than the members of those teams are likely to say that those teams are inclusive. So I think that, you know, potentially there might be some rose-colored glasses in terms of reflecting on the level of inclusion and accessibility in these spaces. Notably, the only participant who wasn't a leader of one of these spaces was the only one to criticise the space for not being accessible in some ways, which was very interesting, and for not meeting their communication needs in particular. So like we need to chat a little bit more with members. We need to chat about people, chat with people who have like seen these spaces and then chose not to engage with them. Like, let's understand why, like what messages a collective sending that maybe for students who don't necessarily have that critical consciousness or justice lens, like what do they take from the way that these spaces talk about themselves? I know from my own private conversations that for some students, that like very sort of like left-leaning, progressive, human rights, advocacy, activism kind of vibe can be off-putting to some students, and like that's okay. And we just need to understand that better and see how we can be more inclusive in our student leadership. Super small sample, sorry. It was my master's thesis, did the best I could. It was so hard and I still had so much data. And I would write a paper about every individual interview because it was so rich. But let's get some more data with a broader sample, including first year students. Didn't speak to any of those. Couple of reasons that could be potentially a low awareness of these groups existing, potentially a low awareness of like what participating in a research study might be like. And so potential barriers on both sides there. Also, international students. Didn't speak to any international students who declared themselves to me as international students. There could be a lot of reasons for that. There was a whole like sub-thread throughout the interviews talking about the engagement of international students in these collectives, and talking about like the unique barriers, but also unique opportunities that international student engagement faces. There was a really lovely story in one of the interviews about an international student who saw the collective, never joined, but had seen it for many years, eventually decided to engage, found out about the concept of neurodivergence and ended up with an autism diagnosis, which was just like, you know, something that in their culture was never something that would have been spoken about, never something that ever would have found out about. But that's just one example of the kind of power of opening up these spaces to people from different cultural backgrounds. And that then speaks back to what messages are these collectives sending about what kinds of students are welcome in them, unintentionally or intentionally, and how can we kind of open that up to make sure these benefits are available to everybody. So I think I've stayed true based on the time that was spent on the introduction, to speaking for about an hour. We've got 20 minutes left in the session. So I first want to give a bit of an opportunity for people to ask questions. On the next slide, I've got some discussion topics. I know for some people, unstructured discussion, you're just going to leave the Zoom. That's fine. Please leave if you don't want to have a chat, but I want to do questions before we move to that. And I've got a few different questions that are framed for people who occupy kind of different positions around university. If you're a staff or if you're a student, if you don't even work at a university, there's a question in there for you too, to kind of ground some discussion. But before we go there, questions, thoughts, feel free to put them in the chat, or turn your microphone on. Use the raise hand function, use a physical raised hand. If you're going to do that, please make sure your camera is on, because otherwise I won't see it and you'll just be like awkwardly raising your hand in your office or in your bedroom and just, yeah. Anyway, I'll stop talking and let you talk. Bailey?
Hi. It's a rather in-depth question, but I'll try and keep it to a short one. I have a meeting this afternoon in an hour that is trying to coordinate two different disability groups at our university. So we have one in the students as partners realm, which is university-led and does the whole staff say no to everything at the end of the day. So I'm trying to start up a club, disability club under our student guild, which the university has no control over. But the university wants to coordinate the two groups, and rightfully so that students are aware of, which group to go to for what kind of things. Do you have any, one piece of advice off the top of your head? What would be your biggest piece of advice for any groups?
Yeah, clear and concise communication, I think, and making sure that students are aware of the dynamic that exists between those two groups. From a governance perspective, my brain goes immediately to, I'd love to see some kind of MOU between the student-led disability club and the staff administrated program of a sort of a staged handover of resources and control over to the student-led program. And that's a challenging thing to do that requires a lot of discussion, but ultimately that's the goal, right? To get things to be student-led.
Yeah. Thank you so much for today too, for your time.
No worries.
It's appreciated.
And on the clear communication, I think just making sure, students know the dynamic, and what you said about, the university wanting students to know which group to go to for which thing is really important. But yes, I think searching for allies in the staff cohort as well, who kind of understand that. Your allies might be in areas that you don't necessarily expect. I know that in my experience, finding those people who understand the difference, because some staff are never going to understand the difference, unfortunately. They're not the staff who are going to be coming to SVA. They're not the staff who are going to be listening to this, but they're going to be the staff that we really struggle to reach. So find the allies, and potentially look at how you can steer towards a handover over time.
No, thank you very much.
No worries. I'm just scrolling through the chat. Kathy's got a great suggestion and comment around some of that. Yes, I would love to see the increase in DSP funding channeled towards some of this. I'm not sure if that will happen. Kathy, go ahead.
So the disability support funding that's provided to every university in Australia has increased. It's causing, right? That was announced in December, right? So universities have full time.
Can you move a bit closer to your microphone, Kathy?
So they have 4 times more funding than they had in the past, right? So they have a lot more funding, and the government is looking for innovative things with that funding. So there's 2 parts to this funding. One thing is the direct support costs for students, and the other part is what is building knowledge base. Right? It's got nothing to do with SAC, it's got nothing to do with benefit. This is funding that the university can use for innovative programs. It can be used to, if they don't have fiscal reaction because the brands and islands and TV, then you can employ people to develop that plan. But that plan has to be co-designed with students with disabilities and staff with disabilities. It can't be done in isolation, right? So there's a bit more for people around that as well. But if you're struggling with student collectives, if you're struggling to get students involved who are trying to maintain those groups because of, people count, all the demands that are on students today is very different to, say, when I first off many years ago, right? So perhaps this is something you can present to your university as you can use the fund for the funding goal. And if it can run, the funding can, the guild can run the program. All the university has to do is report back on, right? And say we spent $20,000 on the student leadership program for students with disabilities, or we spent $20,000 building up the student collective to build a student voice, so students build that sense of belonging. That's all fits the funding guidelines. So you have an opportunity at the moment. Universities at the moment, and I'm not saying this as a manager, I'm saying this as president of the Australian Tertiary Education Network on Disability. So my manager hat is gone. But universities are going, oh my fucking God, how am I going to spend that much money? They have been given more money than they know how to spend at the moment. So it's an opportunity, and it is a time to tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, we need help.
Yeah, for sure. There's so much more money flowing in this direction. The other one is that for universities that hadn't previously been allocating the majority of their SAF funding towards student-led initiatives, they're going to have to start doing that. I think it's like at least 40% of SAF is going to have to go towards student-led initiatives. So that's a nice little pot of money that sending that towards either the student association or sending that towards existing student collectivized activities is a really great option with the right accountabilities, of course. If you're from a university and you're not sure like who your student contact is on that, I do have a giant Excel spreadsheet where if something exists, I probably know about it. So if you're like, oh God, I don't know who to touch base with, like shoot me an email. I've just popped it in the chat for the sake of the recording. It's Ebe Ganon at utas.edu.au, which is ebe.ganon at utas.edu.au. Lots of comments in the chat about if my work will be available to research, available to cite before those things are published. Shoot me an email and we'll see if we can work something out. Preferably, please don't copy and paste from my list of quotations and put that in your business case before talking to me about it first. And if you'd like someone who is independent from your university to come and have a chat to somebody and talk about this research, always happy to do that. Just going through. Thank you so much for the offers of networks as well. My sister studies in Western Australia, and she's offered me some great connections to some of the Western Australian universities as well. It's where I grew up as well, so that's great. Kate?
Thank you so much, Evie. That was really, really cool. I guess I'm thinking about collectives. We have had I'm at Flinders. We have had a history of collectives in the past, but they've kind of dropped off as the nature of the student council has sort of changed over time, and they've become, to my dismay, and other people within the student association become less political and more focused on, I'm not quite sure what really, quite not collective in that way, but they kind of dropped away as well because the students really, those elected student reps really struggled to organize and spend the time and to do that work. It's quite a skill set, as you pointed out, and when you're part of it, that's fantastic. There's a really good, well-functioning queer collective here that sort of had that history and maintained over time, but disability hasn't got off the ground in the same way. That we have a very strong neurodivergent club an association now, which is another kind of way in which students collect as well around clubs and associations. So I assume you probably looked a bit into that as well, not just the collective. Because I think also disability is so broad that I guess coming together under that banner works for some more than others.
Yeah.
That's sort of just like thinking it through where we are at the moment. I'm going to think about that funding, I'm going to think about how we might kind of work to sort of set something up again or help. One thing though that really matters, I think, is connecting that group to some kind of structure of decision making or power, so that they're not just, I just feel like as a staff member asking students to set something up and know that they're just going to be banging their heads against a wall and not getting anywhere is like kind of not fair. And as much as I want them to do it and I would support them, or there'd be staff here that would support them to do it, that's a struggle. I'd have to almost go to, like, I'm not just trying to work out, like, do you have any advice around that?
Yes.
Like, definitely, I think connecting them to like committees or having a subcommittee, or it's still though, as soon as you start getting into formal governance of universities, you understand that we all get pretty shut down. So what's your thoughts, Evie?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is that it would be remiss of me not to communicate from my participants the importance of student remuneration, particularly students who take on like fairly extensive kind of management and leadership opportunities in their collective. I saw it like for a benchmark, which might be helpful. I'm not publishing about this just because it's very rough and I don't have like enough of a sample to talk about it. I spoke to students who receive all the way from $0 all the way up to $400 a week. $400 a week, by the way, sounds like a lot, but if you average that out across like the amount of hours that students are putting in, it's below minimum wage. So I think it's definitely worth thinking about models of student compensation. I know we talk about that in other contexts, but definitely in student leadership, looking at collaborating with student associations around their way of allocating honorarium, around allocating stipends, and like potentially helping student associations who maybe haven't had that conversation yet to build their capacity to talk about that in a robust way, particularly with the increase in staff funding that a lot of student orgs are about to receive. Very exciting. Some of that will not be spent well, and that's just life. Like not all student leaders are good student leaders. That's fine to say. Sometimes that's for reasons of like lack of skill. Sometimes it's for malicious reasons. And like, I think we can be okay with all of those things being true at the same time. But looking at building that sort of functionality into student associations where the collectives are affiliated in that way. The comment about like the lack of continuity between the way that kind of student cohorts move through. I don't think it's something that we can fix. I think it's just how the differences and diversities in student cohorts happen naturally in our universities, and certain things ramp up and ramp down. The one kind of like safeguard for that I would suggest, and has been reflected to me in talking to students, is how do we make sure that we have really good record keeping and really good handover documents, such that students aren't starting from scratch every time you get a passionate student who wants to start something like this. And that there's always space held for it to exist. I spoke to at least one student who knew that there used to be a collective and was really sad that it didn't exist anymore, and so restarted it up. But they had to do all of the governance again. They had to do all of that work, all of that kind of branding, all of that advertising, and all of the kind of infrastructure around that all over again. In terms of like linking collectives into a decision-making / governance model, I think I have two thoughts on that. The first one is that not all students engage with these collectives to do advocacy, and they're really important spaces for just like solidarity and being and existing. And so I think we need to hold space for collectives to not always be doing that kind of systemic advocacy up the chain. What I think is a good balance for that is lots of collectives operate in a model of the disabilities officer, who is elected and sits on the student association, is the convener of the collective. They use their function as the convener of the collective to kind of get that insight and that knowledge about the lived experience of their students. And then they take that through student representative channels in the association or the union or the guild into the different working groups and committees that they sit on. again, a lot of this is relying on having really good student-led organisations and union structures that are authentically student-led. And so not all of that is in our control or in the control of student support practitioners or people who are members of this network. But you'd be surprised about how many levers we come into contact with on a regular basis to kind of improve the way that those representative mechanisms are operating. And I'm hoping that this research kind of opens the door for more research into the importance of those governance structures operating the way that they are. It's looking like my PhD application is wildly going in a different route rather than sticking in this student advocacy space, which is to some extent disappointing, but also more realistic in terms of me realistically being able to get funding to stay in research, which is the way that it is. But I really would love to talk to anyone who's interested. I noticed someone mentioned a student who is potentially doing a project in this space. Like, please send them my email. Always happy to have a chat. But yes, those are my kind of general comments on that, Kate. Sorry, that kind of went in a few different areas, but it's a very complex space where we don't want to put higher expectations on students to be representative when that's not what they're there to do. But you're right in that they need to have some kind of link to a formal decision-making body. But yeah, that's the summary. I hope some of that was moderately useful. Alrighty, noting that we've got only 11 people left in the room at this point, and we've got 4 minutes left. I'm happy to take one more question. I will put the discussion questions in the chat in case you want to use that for your reflective practice. If you've got time blocked out to do that at some point during this week, which I always encourage. Any other questions? If anyone's typed anything in the chat that I've missed, like, feel free to highlight that as well.
This looks like a lot of compliments for you, Ebe.
Oh, I appreciate it. We don't often get space to present student advocacy research from a student perspective that's been entirely informed by students. And so I really appreciate the platform to be able to share it with a group of not just students for once, but also really engaged staff members who are passionate about hearing about this too.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Ebe, for all your hard work with your research and masters, and look forward to reading your articles when they come out. So
Yeah,
this
me too.
You don't know what they look like yet?
Nope.
Yeah, so we'll upload this recording on our YouTube channel and on the website. All of your work here will be freely accessible by everyone because, like you said, we need more students and staff aware of this. But thank you so much for speaking today, and thank you for everyone who attended.
Thanks,
Any
everyone.
final words from anyone?
Hey, thanks for letting me sneak in.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Feel free to reach out by whatever way you prefer. You can find me on LinkedIn. I've dropped my email in the chat and I've said it verbally in the recording as well. So go back to there, but always happy to chat about this topic. It is a special interest, of course. And so, yeah, let me monologue to you. I always will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Lisa.